My name is Michael, I'm 52 years old, and I recently learned that respect isn't bought with money, it's enforced through silence. Imagine paying every single cent for a luxury trip for your entire family, only to realize that in every photograph, in every captured memory, you're the ghost that doesn't belong. My mother-in-law, the woman who smiled while sliding my credit card across hotel counters, made sure to crop me out of her reality while I held the camera. But what she didn't know, as she kept leaving me outside the frame, was that I was already planning how to leave her outside my life, outside my bank account, and outside the comfort she now despises after losing everything. She thinks she's in control because she holds the photo album, but she forgot who owns the house where she sleeps. Humiliation has a price, and I've come to collect the bill with interest she cannot afford to pay. She looked me in the eyes after another expensive dinner I paid for and asked me to step out of the group photo because I didn't match the scenery. In that moment, my blood ran cold, but my mind became crystal clear. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as quiet as the click of a camera, deciding which part of the story will be erased forever. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave a like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. For years, I was the invisible pillar of a structure held together solely by my effort. At 52, I've learned that professional success is a double-edged sword. It gives you the means to provide, but it turns you into a walking wallet in the eyes of parasites. My life ran on precision. I woke up before sunrise, ran my logistics company with an iron grip, and returned each night to a house that sparkled thanks to the money I deposited every month. My wife, Emily, always seemed gentle, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. But the real problem was her mother, Margaret. From the first day I stepped into their family, I felt her disdain. To her, I was the man who got lucky in business, but lacked the pedigree or style she proudly displayed in her circles of appearances. Margaret lived off faded glory and a pension barely enough to cover her hair appointments. Yet around me she behaved like she owned the world. Out of respect for Emily and to keep peace at home, I tolerated her airs of superiority. I paid her medical bills, bought her designer clothes, and most importantly, financed her fantasies of grandeur in front of her friends. I thought generosity would buy her affection, or at least her respect. What a basic mistake for a man who prides himself on being intelligent. In business, if you give too much without guarantees, you get devoured. In family, it's exactly the same. The trip was my idea. It had been an exceptional year at the company. We closed major contracts, and I felt we deserved a break. I spared no expense. I booked a private beachfront villa, first-class flights, and experiences only a small percentage of people can afford. I wanted to see Emily happy, and in my naivety, I thought bringing my mother-in-law would ease the tension that always lingered in the air. During the preparations, Margaret behaved like a queen planning her coronation. She gave orders, demanded itinerary changes, and requested specific menus. I simply watched, mentally noting the expenses while staying silent. My mistake was confusing her arrogance with mere bad manners. I failed to see it was deep, calculated contempt. When we arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Margaret began acting as if I were the group's driver or personal assistant. At upscale restaurants, she ordered the most expensive bottle of wine without even glancing at me, and when the bill arrived, she would simply stand up and walk toward the terrace, leaving me alone with the waiter. Emily followed her mother's lead. I watched her laugh at inside jokes I didn't understand, and little by little, I began to feel like a stranger on my own vacation. I was the one carrying heavy suitcases, solving transportation issues, and tipping excessively so they would receive special treatment. Emotionally, I remained in a state of tense calm. I'm a man who reads people well, and I started noticing how Margaret moved the pieces. She always positioned herself at the center of everything, physically and metaphorically. At dinners, I was seated at the far end of the table. During walks on the beach, they walked ahead, sharing confidences while I trailed 10 steps behind, watching their backs. It wasn't shyness, it was systematic exclusion. I felt that familiar chill in my chest, the warning signal that tells me when a business partner is trying to cheat me. But this wasn't business, it was my family, or at least what I believed was my family, Margaret had a particular obsession with photos. She carried a professional camera and constantly asked hotel staff or strangers to take portraits. "Emily, stand here with your siblings," she'd say. "Everyone together. What a beautiful family." I'd step closer to join, and she'd smile coldly, her voice pretending kindness but sharp as glass. "Michael, dear, could you hold Emily's bag? Too many people ruin the composition." Or worse, "You take the picture. You handle these devices better." At first I didn't think much of it, but after 3 days the pattern was undeniable. I wasn't in any photo. In the digital record of that trip, I didn't exist. I was just the invisible provider, making sure the stage was set so they could shine. Anyone looking from the outside would think I was the luckiest man alive, surrounded by luxury and beauty. But inside, I was beginning to process the magnitude of the disrespect. My mother-in-law wasn't just excluding me from photos, she was erasing me from the family narrative while consuming my resources. And what hurt most was Emily's silence. She saw how her mother pushed me aside, saw my discomfort, and said nothing. That silence was all the confirmation I needed. It wasn't just Margaret. It was a system they had built where I was nothing more than a source of funding. I was alone, surrounded by people who loved my money but despised my presence. And in that isolation, my mind began to work. I stopped being the generous husband and became the businessman who knows when an investment is no longer profitable. The villa was beautiful, the ocean was crystal clear, but I was already seeing the cracks in the walls of my marriage. The situation was clear. I was a guest at my own party, and the hostess was celebrating my absence. The breaking point came on a bright afternoon, on the terrace of a private beach club, where the daily membership cost more than my mother-in-law earned in 3 months. I had arranged a special sunset photo session. I hired a professional photographer to capture what, in my mind, was still a moment of family unity. Margaret was in her element, wearing a silk dress I had bought her the day before at an exclusive boutique. She moved as if she owned the coastline, directing positions and angles. When the photographer began lining everyone up for the main picture, the one that would be framed in the living room, I stepped forward and stood beside my wife. I felt Margaret's hand on my forearm. It was a light touch, almost imperceptible, yet filled with lethal toxicity. She looked straight at me and in a voice loud enough for the waitstaff to hear said, "Michael, it's better if you stand aside. This is a photo of blood family. Additions sometimes ruin the symmetry of the picture. Besides, someone has to make sure no one takes the drinks from the table." The silence that followed was absolute. I searched for Emily's eyes, expecting her to defend me, to set a boundary, to remember that the addition was the man who supported her entire life. But she lowered her gaze, adjusted her hair, and positioned herself next to her mother. That gesture, that absence of voice, was the deepest betrayal I've felt in my 52 years of life. I turned away, without saying a word. There were no raised voices, no dramatic scene. I simply walked to the bar, ordered a double whiskey, and watched from a distance as they smiled for the camera. They were the image of perfect happiness, financed by the ghost they had just expelled from the frame. In that moment, my anger didn't explode, it solidified. It became a glacial cold running down my spine. I understood that to them, I wasn't a man. I was infrastructure. I was the pavement they walked on so their feet wouldn't get dirty, and no one thanks the pavement. That night, while they celebrated with lobster and champagne, once again on my tab, I stayed in the room reviewing my tablet. I wasn't scrolling through social media. I was reviewing accounts, property records, and contracts. I discovered something that quickened my pulse. Margaret, in her arrogance and laziness, had asked Emily to transfer into her name a small apartment I had bought for my wife as an investment. Emily had done it without consulting me. But what they didn't know was that I always include a revocation clause in my gifts on my lawyer's advice. They believed they now had assets of their own, independent from me, built with money taken behind my back. The humiliation continued for the rest of the trip. Margaret constantly made comments about my lack of refinement in front of other guests, mocking my calloused hands, the result of years of hard work before success, comparing them to the clean hands of the men in her family who had never worked a day in their lives. Emily laughed. That sound, my wife laughing at her mother's mockery, was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I felt small, but only physically. Mentally, I began to grow, to detach, to see them as mere pieces of a logistical problem that needed to be solved. On the last day at the airport, Margaret had the audacity to ask me to buy her a watch at the duty-free shop. "It's to remember this wonderful trip you gave us, Michael," she said with a hypocrisy that turned my stomach. I looked into her eyes, noticed the greed in her pupils, and for the first time in years, smiled at her with terrifying sincerity. I bought the watch, the most expensive one in the display case. It was my farewell gift, though she didn't know it. It was payment for the services she had unknowingly provided in my awakening process. When we arrived home, reality hit me with the silence of empty walls. While they uploaded photos from the trip to their social media, photos where I, indeed, appeared in none, I sat in my office. Emily came in a couple of hours later, complaining about being tired and asking what we were having for dinner. I didn't answer. I didn't even look up from my papers. She shrugged and went to bed, assuming my silence was the usual kind, that of the submissive man who endures everything. She didn't realize that man had stayed behind at the beach club outside the photo. The greatest loss wasn't the money or the time. It was faith in loyalty. That night I packed a small suitcase with the essentials and left for a hotel. Not because they were throwing me out, but because that house no longer belonged to me in my heart. Even if legally, it was all mine. Before leaving, I looked at the family portrait Margaret kept in a silver frame by the entrance. I took it out, tore the photo where they stood radiant, and left only the empty frame on the table. It was my symbolic expulsion from their world of lies. The marriage was dead, trust reduced to ashes, and my patience exhausted. Now all that remained was the execution of the reality they themselves had created. Revenge, when slow-cooked, requires a surgical precision that only years in the business world can teach you. I didn't return home that night nor the next. I settled into a private office I keep off the family radar and called my trusted attorney, Daniel. He has handled my affairs for 2 decades and understands that to me contracts are sacred and betrayals are repaid in the same currency, with the law in hand. I asked for a detailed report of every asset, every shared account, and above all, the apartment Emily had transferred to her mother behind my back. My plan wasn't born from blind hatred, but from relentless logic. If I was merely an addition ruining the aesthetic of their lives, then they needed to learn how to live without the benefits that addition provided. For 3 weeks, I maintained absolute calm. I answered Emily's messages with one-word replies, giving the impression I was buried in an exhausting work project. She, accustomed to me being the silent provider, suspected nothing. Meanwhile, I was pulling the threads that held their financial scaffolding together. First, I cut the flow. I cancelled every additional credit card. I didn't report them stolen. I simply reduced the credit limits to a ridiculous amount, enough for coffee, but not for a silk dress. It was fascinating watching the notifications on my phone. Transaction declined. Transaction declined. Panic began to seep into their messages, but I remained unmoved. My attorney found the legal crack we were looking for. The apartment had been purchased with funds I transferred to Emily under the designation of family asset, and transferring it to her mother without my explicit consent violated clauses in our prenuptial agreement and the protected property laws we had signed years earlier. I didn't stop there. Margaret lived in a house whose mortgage I paid through an automatic transfer from one of my secondary companies. I ordered the payments stopped and initiated proceedings to place the property into default for non-compliance. I didn't want her money. I wanted her to feel the cold uncertainty, the same chill I felt when she asked me to step out of the photo. I wanted her to understand that the scenery she loved so much stood because of foundations she had chosen to despise. I met Daniel at a dim cafe, far from our usual routes. He handed me a folder with the divorce papers and the eviction notice for my mother-in-law's apartment. "This is going to be a firestorm, Michael," he said. I simply nodded. I wasn't looking for a firestorm. I was looking for a controlled demolition. I knew Emily would come looking for me as soon as reality knocked on her door, and I prepared myself mentally for that moment. My emotional intelligence, the very thing they mistook for weakness, was now my greatest strength. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't demand anything. I would let the facts speak for me. During those days of preparation, I began rebuilding myself. I went back to the gym, reconnected with old friends I had neglected while dedicating every minute to providing for a family that didn't value me. I started sleeping better. The absence of Margaret and her constant complaints felt like having a weight lifted that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I felt lighter, focused. I was designing my new life, one where I was the protagonist and the sole director of the frame. The strategy was ready. The final blow wouldn't be a physical confrontation, but a lesson in basic economics. The lifestyle they flaunted on social media was a house of cards, and I had just removed the card at the base. I made sure every document was delivered on the same day, at the same hour. The divorce petition for Emily at our house, and the eviction notice and property revocation for Margaret. I didn't want them to have time to coordinate a defense. I wanted the impact to be total. One legal detail they overlooked was that I owned image rights to many of the events I financed through my company. I had my marketing team send a formal notice to Margaret's social media accounts for unauthorized use of corporate-owned material in her promotional posts, the ones where she tried to present herself as a high society influencer. Her accounts, her only source of external validation, were temporarily suspended. I erased her from the digital world the same way she erased me from the family album. The stage was set. Patience was over. Now it was time to watch gravity do its work. The climax wasn't an explosion of shouting, but a silent collapse. I was in my office watching through the security cameras linked to my phone as Emily arrived at the house. I saw the exact moment she found the envelope on the dining table. There were no immediate tears, only total paralysis. Almost at the same time, my phone began vibrating with frantic persistence. It was Margaret. I didn't answer. I let voicemail fill with her screams, shifting from outrage to pleading within minutes. The next morning, I showed up at the apartment Margaret considered hers. I brought 2 court officers and a locksmith with me. When she opened the door, she was still in a robe, her face distorted, and last night's makeup smeared. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. "Michael, what is this madness? You can't do this to me. This is my home," she shouted, trying to reclaim an authority she no longer had. I looked at her with the coldness of someone reviewing a quarterly loss report. I said nothing. I simply handed her the property revocation document. Emily arrived shortly after, breathless, trying to mediate. "Michael, please, let's talk. My mother has nowhere to go. It was a mistake. The photos were nothing. You can't destroy our family over this." Her words confirmed they still understood nothing. It wasn't about the photos. The photos were only a symptom of their contempt. I stepped closer to Emily, close enough for her to feel my presence, and whispered words that cut through the air. "You took me out of the picture, Emily. Now I'm taking you out of my budget. Enjoy the symmetry of your new life." Margaret began packing her suitcases, the same designer luggage I had bought her, filling them with clothes I had paid for. Watching her humbled, forced to ask a neighbor for help carrying her belongings because she couldn't afford a moving service, didn't give me euphoric satisfaction, but a deep peace. It was the justice of reality. She looked at me expecting to see regret, some sign that my good heart would give in, but my heart had turned to steel on that terrace by the sea. The most ironic moment came when Margaret, in a final attempt to hurt me, grabbed her professional camera and threw it at my feet. "Take your damn pictures now, you worthless man!" she screamed. The camera shattered across the floor. I bent down, picked up the memory card that had popped out, and slipped it into my pocket. "Thank you," I said with an icy smile. "Here are the memories I paid for. I'll use them to make sure I never make the same mistake again." As the officers finished the eviction, I received a notification from my bank. Emily had attempted a large withdrawal from our savings account, but my attorney had already frozen the funds due to the divorce filing. I watched her collapse on the sidewalk beside her mother, surrounded by cardboard boxes and designer bags that meant nothing without a roof to store them. There was no reconciliation, no apology, just the sound of my car engine starting as I drove away from the disaster they had cultivated with their arrogance. That afternoon, I sat in a simple restaurant, the kind where calloused hands are welcome. I ordered a modest meal and reviewed the memory card on my laptop. There they were, all the photos from the trip. Using basic editing software, I did to them what they had done to me. I cropped Margaret and Emily out of every landscape, every dinner, every sunset. I left only the beautiful backgrounds, the places I had paid for, places they didn't deserve to inhabit, even as digital memories. I erased them methodically, click by click, until only emptiness or pure scenery remained. The last image I saw was from the beach club terrace. The photographer had captured a moment just before Margaret pushed me out of the group. We were all there, but I appeared blurred, like a shadow. I erased her first. Then Emily. In the end, only the image of the deep blue ocean remained, with the empty chair where I should have sat as the head of the family. I closed the laptop. The cycle was complete. The addition had taken the entire stage, leaving the supposed protagonists on an empty set without lights or audience. Revenge wasn't an act of violence, it was an act of disappearance. I disappeared from their lives, and with my disappearance went their support, their status and their dignity. Han pasado 6 meses desde aquel día en la acera. Mi vida ahora transcurre en un silencio que muchos confundirían con soledad, pero que yo llamo libertad. Elena intentó llamarme cientos de veces, enviando mensajes que pasaban del arrepentimiento a los insultos en cuestión de horas. Los bloqueé todos. No hay nada más peligroso para un hombre que ya ha tomado una decisión que la voz de quien lo traicionó intentando venderle una culpa que ya no le pertenece. Beatriz, por su parte, tuvo que mudarse a un pequeño departamento en las afueras, un lugar que ella solía describir como para gente sin clase. Me enteré por amigos comunes que ha tenido que vender sus bolsos y sus joyas para mantener un ritmo de vida que ya no puede costear. La mujer que me recortaba de las fotos ahora se enfrenta a una realidad donde nadie la mira, donde no hay fotógrafos ni cenas de lujo, solo el reflejo de su propia amargura en el espejo de un baño que yo no pago. A veces, la gente me pregunta si no fui demasiado lejos, si el dinero justifica dejar a una familia en la calle. Yo les respondo con la misma frialdad con la que manejo mis negocios. Yo no las dejé en la calle, simplemente retiré el suelo que yo mismo había construido y que ellas decidieron pisotear. No se puede escupir en la mano que te alimenta y esperar que esa mano siga abierta para recibir tus bofetadas. La lealtad no es una opción en una relación, es la base. Y cuando la base se pudre, toda la estructura debe caer para que algo nuevo y limpio pueda crecer en su lugar. He aprendido que el respeto no se exige, se cultiva. Pero también he aprendido que hay personas que confunden la amabilidad con debilidad. Mi error fue ser el espectador de mi propia vida durante demasiado tiempo, permitiendo que otros dirigieran la escena y decidieran quién salía en el cuadro. Hoy, mi álbum de fotos está casi vacío, pero las pocas imágenes que hay son reales. No hay poses ensayadas ni sonrisas fingidas pagadas con tarjeta de crédito. Solo estoy yo, mis logros y la tranquilidad de saber que nadie más volverá a usarme como un accesorio desechable. La vida es como una lente. Si no enfocas lo que realmente importa, terminas con una imagen borrosa y sin valor. Ellas eligieron la estética sobre la sustancia, y ahora tienen todo el tiempo del mundo para admirar su propia belleza en la carencia absoluta. No siento alegría por su desgracia, pero tampoco siento lástima. Siento por fin una justicia matemática. A veces la mejor venganza no es venganza en absoluto. Es ver cómo la vida cobra sus deudas. Si esta historia te pareció tan intensa como a mí vivirla, deja tu like y cuéntame en los comentarios qué hubieras hecho tú. Y si aún no estás suscrito, activa la campanita para no perderte las próximas historias.